One.
Hey class, this is Mr. Clark, and these are the video lecture notes for History 20, Chapter 4.1, Ancient China. Next slide. The origins of ancient Chinese civilization can be traced back to the 3rd millennium BCE, that is, about 3000 BC. Next slide. The earliest Chinese culture known, the Longshan culture, which existed between approximately 3000 and 1900 BCE, consisted of competing chiefdoms that laid the foundations for the emergence of the first major states. And here's a map of ancient China and showing you where areas of civilization began during that period. Next slide. The first major state was the Xia dynasty, which existed between approximately 1900 and 1600 BCE. Although historians debate whether or not it was legendary, due to the lack of written sources from that time, the archaeological evidence points to a Bronze Age civilization with the capital city at Yerlitu. And here's some of those archaeological digs. Next slide. The next dynasty to emerge, the Shang, which existed between approximately 1600 and 1046 BCE, brings us into history proper, because we have written evidence in the form of oracle bones and bronze inscription. The ancient Chinese used bones as a medium for their earliest writing. Next slide. The last Shang capital was located at Anyang on the North China Plain near the Yellow River, and here's where they're talking about. Next slide. The Shang dynasty's most important legacies were: 1. The earliest form of Chinese writing, and the religion, which involved ancestor worship. And here's a slide that talks about that. Next slide. The oracle bones were used to divine the will of higher powers and the spirits of deceased Shang kings. So these oracle bones were, besides being a writing medium, were used to predict the future. Next slide. The next dynasty, the Zhou, lasted between 1045 and 256 BCE. Began when chieftains to the west of the Shang declared themselves kings and overthrew the Shang dynasty. Next slide. The Zhou justified doing so with the so-called Mandate of Heaven, which states that a higher power withdraws its support from corrupt ruling families and transfers it to righteous ones. And this chart here shows you how the Mandate of Heaven was supposed to work. Next slide. Because it lasted 800 years and saw much change, the Zhou is divided into two major periods, the Western and Eastern Zhou. And this map shows you where their boundaries were. Next slide. During the Western Zhou, kings ruled by granting land and noble titles to kinsmen and allies in exchange for loyalty and service. Next slide. The resulting political system, which saw China divided up by over 100 vassal states, is known as Zhou feudalism. Next slide. During the Eastern Zhou, this nobility became increasingly independent and fought with each other for power and territory. Next slide. Also during this period of instability, three of China's major philosophical traditions emerged: Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism. Next slide. A few declared themselves kings and forged powerful militaries by gearing their kingdoms for war. Next slide. In the end, in 221 BCE, the state of Qin prevailed, initiating China's imperial era. And that's it for chapter 4.1.